My family decided, it's time to put you in a nursing home. They didn't even consult me, but I accepted without resistance, and they believed they had won. What nobody imagined was that I was the one calling all the shots. My name is Margaret. I'm 72 years old, and I'm the mother of 3 children. Michael, 43, Sarah, 41, and Thomas, the youngest, at 38. Before I start telling this real story, I'd like to ask you to write in the comments what city you're listening from. That way, you'll help me keep growing and bring increasingly impactful stories. Continuing with the account, and so you can understand better, I'm going to tell you how it all began. You know that moment when you realize your entire life is about to change, and nobody had the decency to warn you? That's exactly how I felt that Thursday afternoon when my children called me for an important conversation in the living room. They were all there, sitting like it was a business meeting, and I didn't even know I was the main agenda item. Michael, my oldest son, cleared his throat before starting, and that gesture immediately put me on alert. Sarah, my middle child, was holding her daughter-in-law Jennifer's hand with a tension I could feel in the air. Thomas, the youngest, avoided my gaze, fixing his eyes on the floor as if there was something fascinating there. It was in that heavy silence, in that charged atmosphere, that I realized they'd already decided something about me, and I was just there to receive the verdict. It wasn't a conversation. It was an announcement. Michael started with that soft voice, almost paternal, that he used when he wanted to convince someone of something difficult. "Mom, we need to talk about your well-being," he said, and I already knew nothing good would come after that phrase. The words were carefully chosen, polished like precious stones, but the meaning behind them was cold and calculated. He talked about concerns for my health, about the house being too big for an elderly mother to care for alone, about the risks of me always being alone. Sarah added, saying they'd been talking and thought it'd be better if I had professional care. Jennifer, the gold-digging daughter-in-law who always wanted to get her hands on my things, nodded in agreement, with that expression of false concern plastered on her face. It was an emotional story, just to hear, but not the way they imagined. I stayed there, sitting in my favorite armchair, the one I bought myself 30 years ago with money from my work. I listened to every word as if I were watching a poorly rehearsed theater play, where the actors forgot that I was also on stage. Thomas finally raised his eyes and blurted out, "We've already visited some places, Mom. Good places with structure. Places." They were talking about nursing homes, but nobody had the courage to use the word. It was like decorating the package changed the contents inside it. Amanda, Thomas's gold-digging son-in-law, added that it would be best for everyone, and that's when I understood everything. It wasn't about me, it never was. It was about their convenience, about getting rid of the burden of having an elderly mother who, in their heads, only caused trouble. The total humiliation started rising up my throat, but I swallowed hard and let it pass. They expected tears, they expected pleas, they expected me to beg to stay, but I just looked at each one of them, memorizing those expressions of barely disguised relief. Michael took a deep breath, as if he'd just gotten through the hardest part. Sarah smiled slightly, thinking my silence was acceptance. The daughters-in-law exchanged knowing glances, as if they were already planning what to do with my belongings. And there, in that moment of absolute silence, something inside me changed forever. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sadness. It was pure and simple clarity. I finally saw my children for what they really were. Ungrateful children who confused love with obligation. I could have screamed, could have thrown in their faces everything I did over the years. I could have reminded them of the sleepless nights when they were babies, of the jobs I held down alone to pay for their schools, of the times I sold my own things so they wouldn't go without. But what would be the point? People who get to the point of discarding you like an old piece of furniture don't deserve to hear your story. They'd already made their choices, already drawn up their plans, and I was just an obstacle to be removed from the path. Jennifer grabbed a folder with papers, probably brochures from the nursing homes they visited without my presence. Amanda commented something about recreational activities and visiting hours, as if that made everything less painful. I let them talk, let them feel in control. Michael leaned forward, placing his hand on my knee with that gesture that once meant affection, but now seemed condescending. "Mom, we just want what's best for you," he said, and I almost laughed at the irony. What would be best for me would be having children who respected me, who valued my presence, who at least had the decency to ask me what I wanted. But they weren't interested in what I wanted, they were interested in what was easier for them. Sarah opened one of the brochures and started showing photos of small rooms, well-kept gardens, and common rooms full of smiling elderly people. Everything looked so perfect in the photos, so different from the reality I already knew from friends who'd gone through this. It was pure marketing, and they'd bought the illusion completely. Thomas, who'd always been the most sensitive of the three, seemed to notice something in my silence. He looked at me with a flicker of doubt in his eyes, as if he was finally wondering if this was really the right thing to do. But Amanda quickly touched his arm, bringing him back to the script they'd rehearsed. "It's a difficult decision, but necessary," she said with that syrupy voice I'd learned to despise over the years. Necessary for whom? I wanted to ask, but kept my mouth shut. I let them keep believing I was weak, that I was submissive, that I'd simply accept everything without questioning. After all, I'd always been the woman who solved everything in silence, so why would now be different? They had no idea of the mistake they were making. The meeting continued for a few more minutes, with them detailing plans and schedules as if they were organizing a common move. They talked about when it'd be best to make the transition, about how to pack my things, about dividing the furniture that wouldn't fit in the nursing home room. Each word was a stab, but I showed nothing. Jennifer mentioned that some of my antique furniture could be useful in her house, and I finally understood the extent of the greed. It wasn't just about getting rid of me, it was about keeping what I'd built. Michael talked about power of attorney and legal documents, and that's when a light went on in my head. They needed my signature, my cooperation, my consent, and suddenly I realized I still had power, even if they didn't know it. When they finally finished talking, they all looked at me expecting some reaction. The silence weighed in the room like a thick curtain, suffocating. I took a deep breath, straightened my spine, and simply said, "All right, just that." 2 words that made their shoulders relax instantly. Sarah let out a sigh of relief so audible it almost seemed comical. Michael smiled, satisfied with what he interpreted as cooperation. The daughters-in-law looked at each other victoriously, as if they'd just won a battle. Thomas still seemed slightly uncomfortable, but even he seemed to calm down with my response. They didn't realize that my "all right" wasn't surrender, it was strategy. They confused silence with weakness, acceptance with defeat. That was their first mistake, and it wouldn't be the last. I got up from the armchair slowly, feeling the weight of my years but also a new determination in my legs. "I'm going to need some time to organize things," I said, and they readily agreed, relieved there'd been no drama. Michael even offered to help with the paperwork, but I gently refused, saying I preferred to do it at my own pace. They left my house that afternoon with a sense of mission accomplished, believing they'd solved the problem in a civilized way. I closed the door behind them and leaned against it for a moment, finally letting the emotion rise to the surface. But it wasn't tears of sadness that threatened to fall. It was something different. It was the clear awareness that I'd been underestimated by people who should have known me better. And that underestimation would be their ruin. I walked to my office, that small room where I always handled the family's important matters. I opened the drawers full of documents, contracts, deeds, and papers they didn't even imagine existed. For decades, I was the one who kept everything running, who paid the bills, who made the financial decisions, who signed the important papers. They grew up thinking things just happened, that life was easy because I made it easy for them. Now they wanted to discard me, to treat me like an ungrateful daughter treats her parents, completely reversing the roles. I grabbed a specific folder, one that contained information they definitely need soon. I smiled for the first time that day, a small and sad smile, but also determined. They thought they had control, but soon they'd discover who really called all the shots, and when they found out. Have you ever stopped to think about how some people become invisible precisely because they're indispensable? That's exactly what I'd become over the years, so essential that nobody noticed my presence anymore, only my absence when something went wrong. My story didn't start in that living room, in that humiliating meeting. It started decades ago, when my husband passed away and left me alone with 3 small children and a world of responsibilities. I was 28 years old, no solid professional experience, and a pile of bills that kept coming. But you know what I had? Determination. And it was that determination that transformed a scared widow into the woman who built everything from scratch. Michael was only 7 years old, Sarah was 5, and Thomas was a baby in arms who couldn't even walk yet. They depended completely on me, and I couldn't afford to fall apart. I got a job as a secretary at a law firm, working from 8 in the morning to 6 in the evening. But that wasn't enough. It never was. So I started doing extra work at night, typing documents, doing translations, anything that would pay me a few extra dollars. Neighbors took care of the children while I worked, and I made it up by helping them whenever I could. I learned to manage every penny as if it were gold, to make the month's money last until the last day, to turn leftovers into complete meals. Nobody taught me this. Nobody gave me a manual on how to be an elderly mother and strong at the same time. I simply did what had to be done because giving up was never an option. And you know what's most curious? My children grew up thinking life was just like that things simply resolved themselves, like magic. As the years went by, I learned about investments, about how to make money work for me instead of just working for money. I read books, took night courses, talked to people who understood the subject. I bought my first property when Michael was 15, a small apartment that I rented out to generate extra income. Then came another and another. It wasn't luck, it wasn't inheritance, it was sweat and strategy. While other mothers rested on Sundays, I studied contracts and planned the future. My children had new clothes, complete school supplies, birthday parties, and even some vacation trips. They never lacked anything, never knew the real weight of the bills I carried on my back. To them, I was just the mom who was always there, always available, always solving everything as if it were the easiest thing in the world. When Michael wanted to go to college, it was my signature that guaranteed the student loan. When Sarah decided to get married, I was the one who paid for half of the wedding without hesitation. Thomas wanted to start his own business. There I was, organizing the papers, reviewing the business plan, even investing part of the startup capital. I didn't do this expecting eternal gratitude. I didn't do it expecting them to pay me back someday. I did it because they were my children, and a mother's love doesn't come with contracts or clauses. But somewhere along the way, that love was confused with obligation. They started to believe that I simply existed to solve their problems, to sign documents, to be consulted only when they needed something. I became a resource, a useful tool, not a person with feelings and needs of my own. Even after they grew up and formed their own families, I continued being the central axis. When Jennifer, the gold-digging daughter-in-law, had problems with the documentation for the new house, who solved it? Me. When Amanda needed someone to be a guarantor on the commercial lease contract, who signed? Me. When Sarah faced a financial crisis after investing poorly, who lent the money without charging interest? Guess. And look, I don't regret having helped, really. What hurts me is realizing that this whole emotional story of sacrifice and dedication was interpreted as weakness, as infinite availability. They grew up seeing my patience as submission, my generosity as an acquired right. And the daughters-in-law? Oh, they were even worse. From the beginning, they looked at my house, my belongings, my savings, with that gleam in their eyes that I knew very well. The truth is that I managed not just my life, but a significant part of their lives too. Michael never knew how to handle finances well, so I was the one who reviewed his investments and gave advice on where to put the money. Sarah had a tendency to spend more than she earned, and I was always there to help rebalance the accounts before the situation got out of control. Thomas was too much of a dreamer, always with new projects and ideas, and I was the voice of reason that kept his feet on the ground. They called me for everything: how to file income tax, which insurance to contract, how to negotiate with the bank, where to invest extra cash. I was Google, financial consultant, and psychologist, all in one person. And all this while taking care of my own life, my own house, my own responsibilities. I never complained, never charged, never threw it in their faces. I simply did it because that's what a mother does. But there's something they never stopped to think about. What would happen if I simply stopped? If I was no longer there to sign that document, to give that advice, to lend that money? They built their lives on top of a foundation they believed was indestructible, but that foundation was me. And foundations can crack, can give way, can simply withdraw when they're no longer valued. During all these years, I maintained control of everything: bank passwords, important documents, insurance policies, essential contacts, procedures that only I knew how to execute. Not out of malice, not out of a desire for control, but simply because nobody else was interested in learning. They were too busy living their comfortable lives, sustained by my invisible work, and now they wanted to throw me in a nursing home? They thought they could simply continue where they left off without me. The irony of it all is that they believed they were doing me a favor. In their heads, putting an elderly mother in a nursing home was an act of care, of responsibility. They couldn't see that they were discarding the only person who kept the family machinery running perfectly. Jennifer even commented to Sarah, and I overheard on a call, that they'd finally have peace to take care of their own lives without worrying about me. Peace. As if I were a heavy burden that would finally be removed from their shoulders. As if decades of dedication could be erased with a signature on letterhead from a nursing home. I shook my head that day, feeling a mixture of sadness and something that was starting to look like revenge, but it wasn't. It was justice. It was the clear understanding that actions have consequences. Sitting in my office, looking at all those documents, I finally understood the real power I'd always had. It wasn't the power of money, although I'd saved well over the years. It wasn't the power of maternal authority, although they still respected me superficially. It was the power of information, of knowledge, of the invisible structure I'd built and kept running. Each paper in that drawer represented a decision I'd made, a problem I'd solved, a path I'd paved. And now, for the first time in decades, I was going to stop paving. I was going to let them walk alone, without my guidance, without my support, without my interference. It would be a painful but necessary lesson, because an ungrateful child doesn't learn with words, they learn with consequences. I grabbed my phone and started making a mental list of everything that needed to be done, not to harm them purposefully, but to protect myself, to finally put my own interests first, something I'd never done before. Throughout my entire life, I was the woman who solved everything, the unshakable rock of the family, the answer to all problems. But rocks also get tired, also want to rest, also deserve to be cared for. They never asked if I was tired, if I needed help, if I wanted something different. They simply assumed I'd be there forever, unchanging and available. And when they decided they didn't need me around anymore, they thought they could simply file me away like an old document. Their mistake, the fatal mistake, was forgetting that old documents sometimes contain information that nobody else has access to. And without that information, I smiled again, in that sad but determined way. It wasn't about revenge. It never was. It was about teaching my children, even at this stage in life, that respect isn't optional, that the people we love aren't pieces of furniture that can be rearranged according to convenience, that every action has its reaction, and that total humiliation has a price they hadn't even started to calculate. I put the documents back in the drawers, but now with a completely different perspective. They thought they'd made the decision about my life, but in reality, they'd only opened the door for me to make decisions about my own existence. And those decisions would change everything, for all of us. But mainly for them, who would soon discover what it means to lose not just a mother, but the invisible foundation that held everything in place. The real story was just beginning. The call came on a Tuesday morning, without warning, like everything in this emotional story my life had become. It was Michael, with that excessively animated voice he used when trying to disguise something uncomfortable. "Mom, we're going to pick you up in an hour. We want to show you a place," he said, and I already knew exactly what place it was. He didn't even ask if I had other plans, if I was available, if I wanted to go. He simply announced it, as if I were a child who needs to be taken on an educational outing. I hung up the phone and looked around my living room, my house, the space I'd built myself with decades of hard work. They wanted to show me a place, as if I were incapable of looking myself, of making my own decisions. The infantilization had begun, and that hurt more than any words could express. I got ready calmly, choosing a simple but dignified outfit. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me disheveled or defeated. When they arrived, all three were there, Michael driving, Sarah in the passenger seat, and Thomas in the back with that uncomfortable expression he always had when he knew he was doing something wrong but didn't have the courage to admit it. The daughters-in-law stayed home, probably planning how to divide my belongings or decorate their own spaces with my things. I got in the car silently, and the trip was marked by forced conversation about the weather, about neighbors, about anything other than the giant elephant inside the vehicle. They tried to seem natural, but the tension was palpable, like an invisible thread about to snap. I just watched through the window, memorizing the route, mentally noting every detail, as I'd always done. The Sunset Gardens, what an ironic name for a place where people go to wait for the end, was a 3-story building with well-kept gardens and a facade that desperately tried to seem welcoming. It had that institutional smell that all these places have, a mixture of disinfectant with reheated food, and something more indefinable that only exists in spaces where hope goes to die slowly. A receptionist with a trained smile greeted us effusively, as if we were visiting a 5-star resort. Michael had already scheduled a tour, because of course he had. He planned everything down to the smallest details, except the only thing that really mattered, asking what I wanted. Sarah held my arm as if I were going to trip at any moment, and that gesture of false protection made me grit my teeth. I was 72 years old, not 72 balance problems. The girl who guided us through the place had that exaggerated enthusiasm of a commissioned saleswoman. She showed the common room, where some elderly people watched television with empty stares. The cafeteria, with its tables organized in perfect rows and a menu displayed on the wall that promised nutritious and tasty meals. The rooms, small cubicles with a bed, a closet, and a window that looked out to, well, to other buildings. "Here you'll have all the necessary assistance," she said, smiling as if she were offering me a prize. Assistance. That word echoed in my head like a disguised insult. I didn't need assistance. I'd always been the one who assisted others. But there I was, being gently pushed into a corner where inconvenient people are stored until they don't bother anyone anymore. Sarah opened one of the colorful brochures she picked up at reception and started reading aloud the available activities. "Look, Mom, they have craft classes on Tuesdays, bingo on Thursdays, and movie sessions on Sundays," she said, with that forcedly cheerful tone we use with small children. I looked at her and wanted to ask, "Do you really think I traded a lifetime of freedom and dignity for bingo and movie sessions?" But I said nothing. I just nodded, letting her believe I was impressed. Thomas touched my shoulder and said quietly, "It's a nice place, Mom. There are people your age here, my age." As if age were the only thing that defines a person. As if all old people were interchangeable and just needed other old people around to be happy. The total humiliation went beyond words. It was in the gestures, in the looks, in the way they talked to me, as if I'd lost the ability to reason. Jennifer, who met us there after we finished the tour, because of course she wouldn't miss the opportunity to give her opinion, looked around approving everything with enthusiastic nods. "It's so much better than being alone in that big house, isn't it?" she said. And in that moment I perfectly understood her game. The gold-digging daughter-in-law she'd always been, she was already imagining my empty house, ready to be sold or occupied. Amanda arrived shortly after, bringing coffee for everyone except me, as if I didn't deserve even that small courtesy. They talked among themselves about the benefits of the place, about how I'd be well cared for, about how this was best for everyone except for me. But my opinion, apparently, was the least important in this whole equation. The nursing home director, a middle-aged woman with an impeccable suit and a professional smile, invited us to her office to discuss the details. I sat in the chair facing her desk while my children settled around me like zealous guardians. She started talking about monthly fees, about what was included in the basic package and what were extras, as if life and dignity could be divided into packages, like a cell phone plan. Michael took out a notepad and started writing down values, doing mental calculations about how much this would cost. Sarah asked about visiting hours, and the answer, from 10 to 6, except during meals and scheduled activities, made me realize that even my visits would be controlled, scheduled, limited. I'd be an ungrateful daughter of fate if I didn't realize what was happening there. I was being filed away alive. The director slid some papers across the desk in my direction, contracts and forms that needed to be filled out. "It's just a formality," she said with that reassuring tone professionals use when they want to minimize something important. I looked at the papers but didn't touch them. My children leaned in, anxious for me to sign right away, so everything would be resolved and they could return to their comfortable lives. "I'm not signing anything today," I said calmly, and the silence that fell over the office was deafening. Michael started to protest, saying we'd already seen everything, that the place was good, that it didn't make sense to postpone. but I just repeated, "Not today." The director, experienced professional that she was, smiled understandingly and said I could take the papers home and read them carefully. My children weren't happy, but they couldn't force me. Not yet. On the way back, the atmosphere in the car was different. There was barely disguised irritation in the air, frustration that I hadn't simply accepted everything without questioning. Sarah broke the silence, asking what exactly I had against the place. "I don't have anything against it," I replied. "I just want to think it over better." That answer didn't satisfy them, but they had to swallow it. Thomas tried to argue that the sooner I moved, the sooner I'd adapt, as if adaptation were something automatic, as if you could simply adapt to being treated like an object. Jennifer called Michael in the middle of the trip, and from his tone on the phone, I knew she was complaining about my stubbornness. Stubbornness. That's what they now called an elderly mother who dared to have her own opinion about her own destiny. The real story was much more complex than they could see. When they dropped me off at home, Michael tried once more to convince me. "Mom, you need to understand this is for your own good," he said, tired. I looked him in the eyes, and for the first time in weeks, I let a bit of my true emotion show through. "And you need to understand that I'm still capable of deciding what's good for me," I replied firmly. He blinked, surprised by my tone, but said nothing more. They all left with that feeling of mission not accomplished, and I entered my house feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time: pure determination. They thought taking me to see that place would break me, would make me accept the inevitable, but they achieved the opposite effect. For the first time, I saw with total clarity what they thought of me, how they saw me, how much real value they gave to my existence. And that clarity was liberating. I sat down again in my office, but now with a completely new perspective. They'd shown me the nursing home as if it were my inevitable future, but in reality, they'd shown me something much more important: the true nature of my ungrateful children and their gold-digging daughters-in-law. There was no more doubt, no more hope that it was a misunderstanding. They really wanted to discard me, to put me on a shelf where I wouldn't get in the way of their perfect lives anymore. And you know what I realized? That I didn't have to accept that I still had choices, still had power, still had dignity. The visit to the nursing home didn't break me. It strengthened me. It gave me absolute certainty that I needed to act, needed to protect myself, needed to show them that underestimating a mother who spent her entire life solving problems was the biggest mistake they could make. And they were about to learn that lesson the hardest way possible. Because the game had completely changed. And this time, 3 days after that visit to the nursing home, I did something nobody expected. I called Michael and told him I'd thought it over and accepted the move. The silence on the other end of the line lasted a few seconds, as if he were processing whether he'd heard correctly. "Seriously, Mom? Are you sure?" he asked, and I could hear the mixture of surprise and relief in his voice. "I'm sure," I replied with a calm I didn't even know I possessed. "You were right. Maybe it's better to have people around." I almost laughed at the irony of my own words, but kept the tone serene, maternal, exactly what they expected to hear from a resigned elderly mother. I hung up the phone and allowed myself a small smile. The chess game had officially begun, and I'd just made my opening move. The news spread through the family like wildfire. Sarah called me crying with happiness, saying she was relieved to know I'd understood how much they cared about me. Thomas showed up at my house with flowers, a beautiful but belated gesture, and hugged me, saying everything would work out. Jennifer and Amanda, the gold-digging daughters-in-law who'd always looked at my things with bright eyes, could barely hide their satisfaction. They already started asking questions about the house, about the furniture, about what I intended to do with all this. I answered vaguely, saying I was still organizing things, that I needed time to decide. But inside, I observed every reaction, every unspoken word, every greedy look. They were revealing their true intentions without even realizing it, and I was mentally noting everything. Michael scheduled a meeting for the following week to organize the practical details, as he called it. This time, the meeting would be at his house, with everyone present, including the wives. When I arrived, the dining room table was covered with papers, nursing home contracts, documents about the house, various forms that needed signatures. It was like a production line for my own farewell, everything efficiently organized to facilitate my disappearance from their lives. Jennifer had even prepared a snack, as if this were a celebration instead of what it really was. I sat at the head of the table, my usual position at any family meeting, and let them start their presentations. Ungrateful children that they were, they didn't even notice that even in that moment, I still commanded the room just with my presence. Sarah opened a folder and started explaining the transition schedule, a ridiculous corporate expression to describe the process of ripping me from my own life. We thought it'd be ideal for the move to happen in 3 weeks, Mom. That gives you time to organize things and prepare yourself emotionally, she said, as if 3 weeks were a generous deadline to dismantle an entire life. Thomas added that he and Sarah had already talked about dividing some furniture, since at the nursing home you won't need so much stuff. Won't need. As if my needs had been reduced to a bed, a closet, and a chair. I just nodded, agreeing with everything, and I could see relief spreading across their faces. They thought it had been too easy, but they were so focused on the goal that they didn't stop to question my sudden cooperation. Amanda pulled out a document and placed it in front of me. Mrs. Margaret, we prepared a temporary power of attorney just to make things easier while you're adapting to the new place. That way, if something urgent needs to be resolved, Michael can sign for you. Power of attorney. That word hung in the air like a bird of ill omen. I picked up the paper and pretended to read it carefully, although I already knew exactly what was written there. It was broad, comprehensive, gave Michael control over practically everything. They'd thought of every detail, except one. I was still lucid, still capable of reading between the lines, still perfectly understood what signing that meant. I'll read it carefully at home and bring it signed next week, I said. And for the first time, I saw a shadow of frustration on Jennifer's face. But Michael quickly smoothed things over, saying there was no rush, that I could take the time I needed. During that meeting, I was the perfect elderly mother, compliant, a bit confused about some details, asking questions that showed fragility without being completely incompetent. It was a calculated performance, and they bought it completely. The more I showed myself weak, the more they felt strong, the more they let their guard down. Jennifer commented about how nice it would be to have a sewing room in my current room, since it would be vacant. Sarah said she'd always liked my antique china cabinet and asked if I'd mind if she kept it. Thomas, the most subtle, just mentioned he'd need a bigger place for his office, each one revealing their ambitions, their plans for the spoils of my life. And I just smiled and said we'd talk about it later. The emotional story that was unfolding there was that they really believed they'd won. In the following days, I started acting methodically and silently. While they thought I was packing boxes and preparing myself emotionally for the move, I was doing something completely different. I gathered all the important documents, deeds, contracts, insurance policies, account passwords, information about investments, everything that had always been under my control. I made copies of everything, digitized some papers, organized others into specific folders. Then I started changing passwords, altering access, notifying financial institutions about procedural changes. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, just exercising my right to protect what was mine. After all, if they wanted to treat me as incompetent, I needed to ensure my assets would be protected from the greed of the gold-digging daughters-in-law and the negligence of my children. One morning, Michael showed up without warning to help with the boxes. He found me in the living room, surrounded by old photo albums, and his face softened when he saw that. "Reminiscing about the good times?" he asked, sitting down beside me. I showed him photos of him as a child, of all of them growing up, birthdays, graduations, weddings. "Remember when you were little and said that when you grew up you'd take care of me forever?" I asked softly, and I saw something pass through his eyes, guilt, perhaps, or discomfort. "Mom, we're taking care of you now," he replied, but his voice came out less convincing than he probably intended. I just smiled and went back to looking at the photos. I let that moment plant a seed of doubt in him, an unformulated question about whether they were really doing the right thing. It wasn't much, but it was something. Sarah started asking about specific documents, things she needed to locate to help with the organization. House papers, proof of ownership, investment documents. I said I was looking, that they were probably in some box, that my memory wasn't what it used to be. Every time she asked, I gave a vague answer, making her believe I was really confused, that maybe I'd even lost some important documents. Amanda also started getting more interested in my financial organization, offering help almost aggressively. "Let me handle that for you, Mrs. Margaret. "You don't need to worry about these things now," she said, and I pretended to consider the offer while mentally laughing at her transparency. An ungrateful child is bad, but a gold-digging son-in-law is even worse, and I had 2 specimens at home. The date of the move was approaching, and everyone seemed increasingly relaxed, more confident that everything would go as planned. They made plans openly now, discussing who would keep what, how they'd sell the house, how they'd divide the amount. They talked in front of me as if I weren't already there, as if it were just a matter of time until I conveniently disappeared from their lives, and I let them, allowed them to believe in their own narrative. The more secure they felt, the more devastating it would be when reality knocked on the door. I signed some irrelevant papers, gave away some things without real value to create the illusion of cooperation. But the important documents, the ones that really mattered, remained guarded and protected. They had no idea what was coming. The night before the week of the supposed move, I sat once more in my office and reviewed everything I'd prepared. Every document was in order. Every detail had been checked. Every protection was established. They'd interpreted my acceptance as weakness, my calm as resignation, my cooperation as defeat. But in reality, every yes I said was strategic. Every document I looked for and didn't find was purposeful. Every compliant smile was a mask. I'd spent my entire life solving problems, managing crises, thinking 3 steps ahead. Did they really think I'd simply give up the fight? The total humiliation I felt that first day had transformed into fuel, and now I was ready. Ready to show my ungrateful children that underestimating the elderly mother who raised them all was the biggest mistake of their lives. And soon, very soon, they'd start to understand that, because the real game was just beginning. And this time, the first crack in their perfect facade appeared exactly 2 weeks after I announced my acceptance. Michael called me in a tone that tried to hide the irritation, but I knew my children too well not to notice. "Mom, the electricity bill for your house came with late fees. Did you forget to pay it?" he asked, and I could imagine his furrowed brow on the other end of the line. "Oh, it must have slipped by, son. With all this moving around, I ended up forgetting," I replied with that slightly confused voice of someone who's too overwhelmed to keep everything in order. He sighed. In that way, ungrateful children sigh when they think their parents are becoming incompetent. "Don't worry, I'll handle it," he said, and I thanked him sweetly before hanging up. First piece falling. They had no idea how many more would come, because that bill wasn't forgetfulness. Just like it wasn't forgetfulness when the automatic payment for the house insurance mysteriously failed to process, or when the newspaper subscription that Michael always read when he came to visit was canceled without explanation, or when the gardening service that kept the yard impeccable suddenly stopped showing up because the payment hadn't been made. Small details, small failures in the perfectly oiled system I'd kept running for decades. And the truth? I'd canceled or altered each of these payments purposefully. It wasn't sabotage, it was simply stopping doing what I'd always done. After all, if I was going to a nursing home, why would I continue managing everything? The real story was that they never stopped to think about how many things I actually managed. Sarah was next to call a few days later with that high-pitched voice she had when she was stressed. "Mom, the family accountant called saying he needs some documents for the tax return. Do you know where last year's receipts are?" she asked, and I pretended to think hard before answering. "Documents. I think they're in some box that's already been packed, dear." I was organizing so much stuff that I ended up mixing things up. Her silence on the other end was delicious. Throughout my entire life, I was the person who had everything cataloged, everything organized, every paper in its proper place. Now suddenly, I was confused and disorganized. Sarah tried to stay calm, but I heard the frustration in her voice when she said she'd try to look herself. Good luck with that, I thought. The documents were safe, but not where she'd ever think to look. Thomas showed up at the house one afternoon, visibly disturbed. He'd tried to access a joint account we had for family emergencies, an account I'd opened years ago and always used to help when any of them needed it. "Mom, the account password changed and the bank said only you can change it. What happened?" he asked, and for the first time I saw something I hadn't seen in a long time in his eyes. Real concern. "Oh, son, the bank asked me to update it for security reasons. With the move and everything, I ended up forgetting to tell you guys," I lied smoothly. "I can give you the new password," I offered, but then made a dramatic pause. Or better yet, when I get settled in the nursing home, we'll sort this out calmly. I saw his jaw contract slightly. For the first time, he realized that maybe things weren't as simple as he'd imagined. The gold-digging daughters-in-law were the first to feel the real impact. Jennifer called me trying to keep a casual tone, but failing miserably. "Mrs. Margaret, that lawyer contact you used, you know? Michael needs to talk to him about some house papers, but we don't have his number." I knew exactly what papers. They wanted to start the property transfer process, probably already dreaming about the sale and the money that would come. "Oh, Jennifer, I think it's on my old cell phone, but I don't remember the password right now." "My memory's been so bad," I replied, and I heard her irritated breathing on the other end. Amanda was more direct, showing up at my door with a list of urgent things that needed to be resolved. But for each item on the list, I had a perfectly plausible excuse about lost documents, forgotten passwords, or information I simply couldn't remember. What started as small inconveniences quickly escalated to bigger problems. Michael discovered that the family health plan, which I'd always renewed and managed, had pending issues because I hadn't sent the necessary documents for the annual renewal. Sarah realized that some automatic bills I'd always paid from my own account, things she didn't even know I covered, had suddenly stopped. Thomas's car insurance, which I helped pay every year as a gift, wasn't renewed, and he only found out when he got a ticket. Each of these problems was like a domino piece falling, and they were starting to realize there were far more pieces than they'd imagined. The elderly mother, who'd always solved everything, was apparently losing control. Or that's what they thought. One night, all three showed up together at my house, without the wives, and I knew immediately it was serious. They sat in the living room with expressions that mixed concern and frustration. Michael got straight to the point. "Mom, a lot of things are going wrong lately. Late bills, documents that don't show up, passwords that don't work. We're worried." Worried. What an interesting word. Worried about what exactly? About me, or about the fact that suddenly they couldn't access everything they needed anymore? "It's all this change, children. It's been harder than I imagined," I replied with a tired voice, and it wasn't a lie. It was being difficult, but not in the way they thought. Sarah took my hand and said, "We can help you, Mom. Let us solve these things for you." But I just shook my head. "I don't want to be a burden. I'll try to organize better." What they didn't understand was that organizing better meant continuing to remove, little by little, all the threads I'd woven over the years to keep their lives running perfectly. That invisible safety net I'd built, payments here, contacts there, organized documents, automated systems, was being carefully dismantled. Not all at once, because that would be obvious, but gradually, strategically, letting them feel the absence without being able to point out exactly what was wrong. It was like removing grains of sand from an hourglass, one by one. At first it doesn't seem to make a difference, but eventually time stops passing. And they were starting to feel that, the sensation that something fundamental was missing, but without being able to identify what. Jennifer and Amanda started pressing harder, offering help, increasingly insistently. They showed up at my house with flimsy excuses, trying to rummage through my cabinets, my documents, my life. But I was always one step ahead, with everything that mattered already protected, already stored, already out of their reach. One afternoon, I caught Amanda trying to open drawers in my office while pretending to look for a glass in the kitchen. "Can I help you find something?" I asked calmly from the doorway, and the shock on her face was worthy of a photo. "Oh no, I was just looking for paper to write down a message," she stammered. A gold-digging son-in-law always reveals themselves when the pressure increases, and she was revealing herself in vibrant colors. The situation reached a point where they scheduled another family meeting, but this time the tone was different. There was urgency in the air, a tension that didn't exist before. Michael started saying they needed to speed up the process, that the longer it took, the more complicated it would get. Sarah suggested that maybe it would be better if I gave them some powers of attorney just until I adapted to the nursing home, so they could resolve the pending issues. Thomas, always the most direct when pressured, finally blurted out, "Mom, we can't solve anything without you. It's like everything stops when you're not involved." And there it was, finally said out loud, the truth I'd been waiting for them to discover. I was the axis, I always had been, and without me, the wheel simply didn't turn. They were starting to understand the size of the mistake they'd made, but they still thought it could be solved with a few signatures. Poor, ungrateful children. If only they knew the worst was still to come. The phone call came at 2 in the morning, that kind of call nobody wants to receive because it never brings good news. It was Sarah, crying so hard she could barely form coherent sentences. "Mom, John and we had a terrible fight. He said he can't take it anymore, that everything's chaos, that I only think about you and your problems." I stayed silent, listening to her sobs on the other end, feeling a pang in my chest that was part pity, part vindication. Her marriage, always so perfectly balanced on the surface, was cracking under the pressure. And the irony? They thought putting me in a nursing home would solve problems, but in reality they'd created much worse ones. "Calm down, daughter. Things will work out," I said with that maternal voice that never ceased to exist, even after everything. But inside, I knew they wouldn't work out, not anytime soon. The emotional story of the perfect family was crumbling, piece by piece. Michael was next to feel the weight of the consequences. He'd invested in a business opportunity that, according to him, was guaranteed. But it was the type of investment that I, if I'd been consulted, would have advised against immediately. It lacked working capital, the business plan was weak, and the partners were people I didn't trust. But he didn't ask me, didn't consult me, simply went ahead thinking he understood everything on his own. 3 weeks later, the business started sinking. He called me desperate, asking for an emergency loan to cover the losses. "Mom, I need $40,000. It's urgent. If I don't cover this now, I'm gonna lose everything." His voice was different. There was real panic there. And for the first time in my life, I said no. "Son, with this whole move to the nursing home, I had to reorganize my finances. I can't help right now." The line went silent for long seconds before he hung up without saying goodbye. Jennifer was the first of the gold-digging daughters-in-law to show her true face when money started getting tight. She and Michael had an expensive lifestyle. Big house, imported cars, frequent trips, designer clothes, all sustained by a combination of credit and the false security that there would always be Mom's reserve if something went wrong. Now that this reserve was inaccessible and Michael's business was crumbling, the bills started turning red. I heard from Sarah that Jennifer had threatened to leave, saying she didn't get married to live with debts. She even mentioned that if Michael didn't solve the mother-in-law situation soon, she'd need to rethink the marriage. Mother-in-law situation. That's what I was called now. A situation to be resolved. The total humiliation had returned, but this time it was she who humiliated herself by revealing her mercenary nature so openly. Thomas and Amanda faced different but equally devastating problems. The business Thomas had opened with my initial investment was going well until he decided to expand, again, without consulting me. He took out large loans, trusting that growth would be linear and constant. But businesses don't work like that, and when sales dropped seasonally, he found himself drowning in debt. Amanda, instead of supporting him, started blaming him for everything. "You should have asked your mother for more money before she got confused," she said in an argument I accidentally overheard when I called and they forgot the phone was on. Confused. A gold digger always thinks others are fools. She really believed I'd lost my mind, when in reality I was more lucid than ever, watching everything from a distance like a director watching his play unfold. Sarah faced her own battles. Without my monthly financial help, something I gave discreetly so she could maintain the standard of living John expected, the bills started piling up. The credit card maxed out, the overdraft went to the limit, and John discovered debts she'd been hiding for months. "What have you been spending on, Sarah? Where are these charges coming from?" he shouted, and she had no answer. Because the truth was, she'd gotten used to living beyond her own means, trusting that I'd always be there to cover the difference. She was an ungrateful daughter who never learned the real value of money because she always had someone protecting her from consequences. And now, without that protection, the house of cards was collapsing quickly. The fights became constant in all 3 homes. I heard through phones they forgot to hang up, through conversations that reached me through concerned neighbors, through the tired and tense faces every time they visited me. Michael and Jennifer argued about money almost every day. Sarah and John barely spoke, communicating through cold notes left on the fridge. Thomas and Amanda had reached the point of sleeping in separate rooms. And what they all had in common in these arguments? Me. Always me. The elderly mother who had abandoned her responsibilities, who had chosen the worst time to get confused, who had disorganized everything. They blamed me for their own incompetence, for their own greed, for their own bad choices. It was easier to point the finger at me than to admit they'd built their lives on a foundation they never learned to maintain on their own. They were starting to understand the size of the mistake they'd made, but they still thought it could be solved with some signatures. Poor, ungrateful children. If only they knew. Jennifer was the first to make the decisive move. On a particularly tense night, she packed her bags and went to her mother's house, taking the 2 small children. "I'm not coming back until you sort out this whole mess," she told Michael before leaving. And this mess meant not just the debts, but the entire situation involving the family. Michael showed up at my door that night, for the first time in weeks, looking truly vulnerable. "Mom, my family's falling apart," he said, and there were genuine tears in his eyes. Part of me wanted to hug him, console him, solve everything as I'd always done. But the stronger part, the part that had been humiliated and discarded, remained firm. "Son, you're an adult man. You have to learn to solve your own problems," I replied gently, but firmly. I saw something break in him in that moment, the realization that the safety net had really disappeared. Amanda followed Jennifer's example days later, but was even crueler. She not only left home, but took with her important business documents from Thomas, joint bank accounts she emptied, and left a note saying he should have thought better before prioritizing an ungrateful mother-in-law instead of his own family. Ungrateful mother-in-law. The irony was so absurd, I almost laughed when Thomas told me, sobbing, sitting in my kitchen like a little boy who'd gotten hurt at the playground. "Mom, I don't know what to do. Everything I built is falling apart," he sobbed, and I made coffee, placed a cup in front of him, but didn't offer solutions. I didn't offer money, didn't offer contacts, didn't offer the strategic advice he'd gotten used to receiving. I just listened, and my silence said more than any words could say. Sarah was the last to have her complete collapse, but when it happened, it was devastating. John asked for a separation after discovering the real extent of her debts. "I can't trust you, Sarah. You lied, hid things, spent money we didn't have, and now your mother, who always solved everything for you, isn't doing that anymore. And you know what I realized? You don't know how to solve anything on your own," were his words, according to what she told me between uncontrollable sobs. She showed up at my door that night, asking to sleep in her childhood room. And I allowed it because I was still a mother, still felt her pain, still had love in my heart. But when she asked the next morning if I could help her with the divorce lawyer and cover her debts so John would reconsider, I shook my head. "Daughter, you need to face the consequences of your choices," I said, and I saw in her eyes the same disbelief I saw in the others. In those weeks of chaos, I watched from a distance the complete collapse of the family structure they thought was so solid. The gold-digging daughters-in-law had shown their true colors, fleeing at the first sign of financial storm. The ungrateful children finally understood, too late, that they'd confused availability with obligation, patience with weakness, unconditional love with eternal guarantee of support. They'd pushed me away thinking they'd get rid of a burden, but in reality, they'd removed the only thing that kept everything standing. And now, seeing their lives crumble, they began to perceive the true value of what they'd discarded. The decision to put me in a nursing home hadn't brought peace, it had brought chaos. It hadn't simplified their lives, it had exposed all the cracks my constant presence had been hiding. And the punishment didn't come in the form of elaborate revenge or calculated malice. It came simply from my absence, from the void left when someone essential disappears. They were learning a painful lesson, and I was just beginning. The confrontation I knew would come finally happened on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Michael showed up at my door without warning, but this time there wasn't the confident posture of always, nor the condescending tone he used when talking to me in recent weeks. He was different. Deep dark circles, wrinkled clothes, an appearance of someone who hadn't slept properly in days. He entered without waiting for an invitation and stood in my living room, looking around as if seeing the place for the first time. "We need to talk, Mom. Really this time," he said, and there was something in his voice I hadn't heard in a long time. Genuine desperation. I sat in my armchair, the same one where I'd heard the nursing home sentence weeks ago, and indicated the sofa for him. The wheel had turned completely, and now it was he who needed my attention. He started in a controlled way, trying to maintain composure, but quickly the words began coming out jumbled, loaded with accusation and frustration. You did it on purpose, didn't you? All this confusion with documents, forgotten passwords, late bills. You're sabotaging everything because you got mad at us, he said, pointing his finger in my direction as if he were in court accusing a criminal. I could have gotten defensive, could have denied, could have pretended to be the confused little old lady they so wanted me to be. But you know what I did? I laughed. It wasn't a malicious laugh, it was a laugh of relief, of liberation. Sabotaging? I repeated the word, tasting it on my tongue. Son, I simply stopped doing what I always did. If that caused so much damage, maybe you should ask yourself why you depended on me so much in the first place. The silence that followed was dense, heavy as lead. I saw the words processing in his head, the slow but inevitable realization of what I was saying. Sarah and Thomas arrived shortly after. Apparently the ambush had been planned. They were waiting in the car. The three stood there, standing in my living room like an improvised tribunal. And for the first time in a long while, I felt I'd finally have the chance to speak my truth. You want to know what really happened? I'll tell you, I said, and my voice came out firmer than it had in months. It wasn't the voice of the resigned elderly mother. It was the voice of the woman who built everything alone and who was finally tired of pretending weakness. Do you remember that meeting, weeks ago, when you called me here and announced you'd decided my life without even asking me what I wanted? I began, and I saw all three look away. You talked as if I were a problem to be solved, an old piece of furniture that needed to be discarded. The daughters-in-law agreed with everything, already planning what to do with my things before I even left the house. And what did you expect? That I'd accept silently? That I'd thank you for the total humiliation? Sarah tried to interrupt, saying it wasn't like that, but I raised my hand, asking for silence. No, you had your chance to speak. Now it's my turn. Thomas swallowed hard, and for the first time, I saw real guilt in his eyes. Ungrateful child or not, there was still a spark of conscience there. I raised you three alone after your father died. I worked 2, sometimes 3 jobs, so you wouldn't go without. I learned about finances, investments, administration, all while taking care of a house and 3 children. Every opportunity you had, every comfort, every security, was built with my sweat and sacrifice. My voice started to tremble, not from weakness, but from emotion contained for decades. And I'm not saying this to collect, to throw in your faces. I'm saying it because you need to understand one thing. I always solved everything not because it was an obligation, but because it was love, and you confused the two. Michael opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come out. What could he say? They knew I was right. When you grew up and formed your own families, I continued helping. Whenever you needed, there I was. Documents? I solved them. Financial crises? I helped. Advice? I gave it. I became so essential that you stopped noticing my presence. You only felt my absence when something went wrong, I continued. And now tears were starting to roll down my face, but I didn't wipe them away. Let them see. Let them understand the pain they caused. And your gold-digging daughters-in-law? Jennifer and Amanda never saw me as a person, only as a source of resources and an obstacle to what they wanted to inherit. Did you really think I didn't notice the looks, the subtle comments, their interest in every detail of my financial life? Sarah started crying too, but I didn't stop. I needed to say everything. So you decided, without consulting me, that it was time to put me in a nursing home. Not because I needed special care, not because I was sick or incapable, but because it was convenient, because it was easier for you, because that way you could live your lives without the worry of having an elderly mother around. My voice got harder in this part, colder. You took me to visit that place as if I were a child being shown her new school. You talked about strict schedules, small rooms, scheduled activities, as if that's what I deserved after a lifetime of dedication. And when I accepted without resistance, you were relieved. Finally, the problem was solved. Thomas lowered his head completely, unable to face me. But you know what you forgot? I asked. And now there was an almost educational tone in my voice, like a teacher explaining an important lesson. You forgot that I'm the person who keeps everything running. All the passwords, all the contacts, all the procedures, all the solutions to problems you don't even know exist. Everything goes through me. And when you discarded me, when you decided I was no longer necessary in your lives, I simply stopped doing what I always did, not out of revenge, not out of malice, but because if I'm going to a nursing home, it doesn't make sense to continue managing your lives, does it? The irony of the situation finally fell on them, like a bucket of cold water. They'd created their own disaster. And now you're here, desperate, because your marriages are crumbling, your finances are collapsing, and you don't know how to solve anything on your own. Your wives fled at the first sign of difficulty, proving exactly the type of people they always were. And you want to blame who? The mother you tried to discard? The woman you treated like an inconvenient burden? I got up from the armchair, standing for the first time since the conversation began. I was shorter than all three, but in that moment, I felt giant. You didn't abandon me. I withdrew. There's a huge difference between the two, and that difference is called dignity. The emotional story they thought they were living was, in reality, a lesson in consequences. Sarah was the first to break completely, falling to her knees on the floor and sobbing. "Mom, I'm so sorry. We were wrong. We were so wrong. Please forgive us. We need you." Michael remained silent, but I saw tears rolling down his face too. Thomas approached, trying to hold my hand, but I gently withdrew it. "Need me? Or need the things I do for you? There's a difference, and until you understand what it is, nothing will change," I said. And for the first time in my life, I established a clear boundary with my children. I spent my entire life being the unshakable rock of this family. But rocks also get tired, also deserve rest, also deserve to be valued. And you only realized my value when I was no longer available to solve everything. They stood there, all three, my ungrateful children who finally understood the size of the mistake they'd made. But understanding was just the first step. Now came the hardest part. The weeks following that confrontation were like watching a train in slow motion, completely derailing. Michael was the first to feel the total impact of his choices when the bank notified him they were going to foreclose on his house. Without my financial help, without the contacts I'd cultivated over the years, and with Jennifer having taken half the remaining money when she left, he simply couldn't keep up with the payments. He called me crying, begging for help, saying he was going to lose everything. "Mom, I'm going to end up on the street. My kids are going to end up on the street. Please, you have to help me," he pleaded, and each word was like a knife in my heart, because I was still a mother, still felt pain seeing him suffer, but I was also a woman who'd been discarded, humiliated, treated like a problem. And sometimes, love needs to be tough to teach. "Son, you're a 43-year-old man. You have education, experience, capability. You need to learn to solve your own problems," was all I said before hanging up. I heard through Sarah that he lost the house 3 weeks later. He had to move to a small apartment in a distant neighborhood, a cramped and modest place that was the opposite of everything Jennifer always wanted. She, the gold-digging daughter-in-law who dreamed of the inheritance that would come when I died, discovered the hard way that there was no guaranteed inheritance, no more safety net, no more convenient mother-in-law solving all problems. She filed for divorce shortly after, taking the kids and demanding alimony that Michael could barely pay. He'd built his life on sand, and now the tide had risen. Thomas faced his own collapse when his business finally went under. Without capital to maintain operations, without the strategic advice I'd always given, and with Amanda having sabotaged important documents before leaving, there was no way to save it. He closed the doors on a rainy Tuesday, firing the 3 employees he had and selling everything for a fraction of the real value just to pay part of the debts. The gold-digging son-in-law, or rather, ex-son-in-law, Amanda had left so fast she didn't even wait for the dust to settle. She was already with another man just a month later, someone with established money, no risks, no problems. Thomas discovered through social media, seeing photos of her smiling in expensive restaurants while he ate instant noodles in a friend's apartment where he was temporarily living. His total humiliation was complete, but necessary. Sarah had a different collapse, more emotional than financial, although money was also a huge problem. John's divorce was quick and brutal. He didn't want to negotiate, didn't want to hear excuses, simply divided everything in half and left, leaving her with half the debts she'd hidden and none of the comforts she was accustomed to. She had to sell the car, cancel gym and club memberships, give up the designer clothes she loved so much. But the worst for Sarah wasn't the material loss, It was the social one. The friends she cultivated in the circuit of expensive parties and events simply disappeared when they discovered her financial situation. My ungrateful daughter, who'd always been the first to judge others for their choices, was now being judged in the cruelest way. And she didn't have the emotional structure to deal with it alone, because she never needed to develop that structure. I was always there to protect her. All three tried to get closer to me with almost desperate frequency. They showed up at my door with flowers, with cards, with promises of change. "Mom, we learned our lesson. Please let us fix this," Michael said whenever he came. Sarah cried, saying she couldn't sleep from so much guilt, that she understood now how much she'd messed up. Thomas stayed silent most of the time, just looking at me with those eyes that begged for forgiveness without using words. And me? I received them, offered coffee, listened to what they had to say. But when they asked for financial help, when they asked for contacts, when they asked me to solve one more problem, I gently refused. "You're capable. You'll make it," I said, and I saw the frustration growing in them. They wanted the problem-solving mom back, not the mom who believed in them. Jennifer had the audacity to show up at my door a few months later, without Michael, trying to make peace on her own. "Mrs. Margaret, I know I made mistakes. But think about the children. They need stability," she said with that syrupy voice she always used to manipulate situations. But I was no longer the naive old woman she thought I was. "Jennifer, the children are their parents' responsibility. Michael is a capable man, just as you're a capable woman. You'll find a way," I replied, and I saw her mask drop for a second, revealing the anger behind the facade. She left furious, and I heard later she was spreading to whoever would listen that I was a cruel and vindictive mother-in-law. Let them think what they wanted. The truth was I was finally protecting myself, something I should have done much earlier. Amanda, on the other hand, simply disappeared from all our lives. She got what she wanted, a new relationship with someone financially stable, and didn't look back once. She didn't call Thomas, didn't ask about the family, simply moved on as if those years had never existed. It was a real and emotional story of pure greed and opportunism, and Thomas had to swallow that bitter truth alone. He tried to tell me several times about how he felt betrayed, used, but I just listened without offering the comforting advice he sought. "Son, people show who they really are when things get difficult." She showed. "Now you need to decide what to do with that information," was all I said. He needed to learn to process his own emotions, his own disappointments, without having Mommy there to heal all wounds. What was perhaps most interesting to observe was how each of them dealt with the new reality. Michael became darker, more closed off, working 2 jobs to pay bills and alimony. Sarah started going to therapy, something I'd suggested years ago, but she always refused, and gradually started rebuilding her life in a more authentic way, less dependent on appearances. Thomas plunged into a deep depression for a few months, but eventually started looking for work in his field, accepting positions lower than his pride would like. But that paid the bills. They were learning, painfully, to live without the safety net I represented. And although it was painful for me to watch, I knew it was necessary. An ungrateful child only learns when they feel the consequences of their own choices on their skin. There was a moment, about 6 months after that initial confrontation, when Michael showed up at my door completely different. He'd lost weight, had more gray hair, deep lines on his face that weren't there before. But there was something more in his eyes, something I hadn't seen in a long time, genuine humility. "Mom, I didn't come to ask for money or help. I came to ask for forgiveness. Really, this time, I finally understood what we did. We discarded you, treated you like a burden, when in reality, you were the glue that kept everything together. And we only realized how much you did when you weren't doing it anymore," he said. And this time, there was no manipulation in the words, only raw truth. I hugged him, letting him cry on my shoulder like he did when he was a child. But when he tried, hesitantly, to ask if I'd consider going back to helping, I shook my head. "Michael, I forgive you. I forgive you, Sarah and Thomas. But forgiving doesn't mean going back to being who I was before. That woman who solved everything, who was always available, who sacrificed herself without limits. She got tired. She deserves rest. She deserves to live for herself," I explained, and I saw understanding finally reaching his eyes. "You'll be able to rebuild your lives, but you need to do it with your own strength. I won't be your crutch anymore. I can be a mother, I can offer love and emotional support, but I won't go back to being the problem solver. That era is over. It was one of the most difficult conversations of my life, but also one of the most liberating, because finally, after decades of being the axis of everything, I was choosing myself. And that choice, although painful for everyone, was the only one that would allow me to live with dignity. Their punishment wasn't eternal, but the lesson needed to be engraved, and for it to stay, I needed to maintain my position firmly, no matter how much my mother's heart wanted to give in and solve everything one more time. The final decision about the nursing home came on a peaceful Sunday morning, when I woke up and realized there was no more weight on my shoulders. I called Sunset Gardens and politely canceled the reservation my children had made. The receptionist seemed confused, asking if everything was okay, and I responded with a conviction I hadn't felt in months. Everything's great. I just changed my mind about my life. Then I called each of my children and said simply, I'm not going to the nursing home. I'm going to make other choices for my life, choices that are mine. There were protests, of course. Michael tried to argue about safety and care. Sarah cried, saying they'd planned for this. But I maintained my position. For the first time in decades, I was putting my own needs first, and that was liberating in a way I could barely describe. I spent the following weeks restructuring my life in a way that made sense for me, not for them. I put the big house up for sale, that house that carried so many memories, but also so much weight. Each room had a story, each wall had witnessed moments of the family I built, but it had also witnessed my exhaustion, my loneliness disguised as availability, years of sacrifice that were interpreted as obligation. It was time to let go. I found a buyer quickly, a young couple with small children who looked at the house with the same enchantment I had decades ago. You'll be happy here, I said at the contract signing, and I genuinely wished they would be, that they'd write better stories on those walls than the ones I'd lived in recent years. With the money from the sale and the savings I'd carefully tucked away throughout my life, I looked for something completely different. I didn't want another mansion, didn't want huge responsibilities or empty spaces that reminded me of absence. I found a small but charming cottage in a coastal town 2 hours away. It had 2 bedrooms, a cozy kitchen, a porch overlooking the sea, and, most importantly, it represented a new beginning. I didn't tell anyone where it was until I was completely settled. I needed that space, that distance, to discover who Margaret was without being the problem-solving mom, without being the convenient elderly mother, without being the unshakable rock everyone expected. Just Margaret, a 72-year-old woman who deserved to live for herself. The move was easier than I imagined because I only took the essentials: clothes, some beloved books, selected photographs, the ones that brought good memories, not weight. The antique furniture, the family china, the objects of sentimental value I always thought about passing to the children were stored in a warehouse. One day you might want this, I told Michael when I explained. But now, you need to prove you understand the real value of things, not just the monetary or sentimental value. He didn't respond, just nodded, and in that gesture, I saw he was finally starting to understand. The emotional story wasn't about eternal punishment, it was about learning, growing, changing, and that took time. In the first months at the cottage, I discovered a version of myself I'd forgotten existed. I woke up when my body asked, not when an alarm dictated. I had coffee on the porch watching the sun rise over the ocean, something I never had time to do before. I started attending a book club at the local library where I met other women my age who had their own stories of new beginnings and discoveries. I took watercolor classes on Tuesdays, something I'd always wanted to try but never found time for. I walked on the beach every afternoon, feeling the sand on my feet and the wind on my face, allowing myself to simply exist without purpose beyond the pleasure of being alive. It wasn't loneliness I felt, it was peace. A deep peace that came from not having to carry the weight of the world on my shoulders anymore. The children tried to visit several times in the first months, but I established clear boundaries. You can come, but with advance notice, and understand that my life now has its own routine that I won't interrupt for your convenience, I said firmly. Sarah was the first to visit, showing up on a Saturday morning with a cake she'd made herself, something I'd never seen her do before. We sat on the porch, drank tea, and talked. But it was different this time. She told me about her therapy, about how she was learning to be independent, about a new job she'd gotten. She didn't ask for money, didn't ask for advice about financial problems, just shared her life like a daughter shares with her mother. And when she left, she hugged me and said, "Thank you for not giving up on me, even when I deserved it." That touched my heart in a way no previous apology had. Thomas took longer to visit, carrying the weight of shame and wounded pride. When he finally showed up, he brought wildflowers he'd picked on the way, a simple but genuine gesture. "I didn't know what to bring to a mother who doesn't need anything," he said with a sad half-smile. We walked on the beach together, and he told me about his new job, about how he was rebuilding his life brick by brick. "You know what's funniest, Mom? Amanda made a point of finding me the other day to tell me how happy she is. I think she expected me to be devastated," he said. "And were you?" I asked. "No. Actually, I realized she did me a favor. If we'd stayed together, I never would have learned to support myself alone." I heard that and felt genuine pride. My ungrateful son was becoming a real man, not through my interference, but through his own struggle. Michael was the last, and when he arrived, he brought the grandchildren, something he hadn't done before, as if he'd been afraid of using the children to manipulate me. But this time, the intention seemed pure. "They missed you, Mom, and so did I," he said simply. We spent the afternoon together. I showed the children shells on the beach, told stories, made cookies with them in my small kitchen. Michael stood watching from a distance, and when the children went out to play, he approached. I lost the house, lost my wife, lost almost everything. But you know what I realized? I was living the wrong life, a life built on appearances and dependency. Now, living in a simple place, working hard, having to explain to my kids why Daddy can't buy everything they want, I'm being a better father, a better man. I held his hand and said nothing. Sometimes, acknowledgement is answer enough. I established with them a new type of relationship, one that had healthy boundaries and mutual respect. They could call me, but didn't expect me to solve their problems. They could visit, but respected my need for space and privacy. I helped emotionally when they asked, offered ears when they needed to vent, but maintained the firm position of not solving financially or practically the consequences of their choices. At first it was difficult, every fiber of my mother's being wanted to jump in and solve, protect, make things easier. But I resisted, because I knew doing that would rob them of the opportunity for real growth. And over time, it got easier. I saw my children become stronger, more capable, more aware. The ungrateful daughter, the ungrateful son. Those labels were slowly being replaced by something more complex and real. Flawed adults, but growing. I made new friendships at the cottage, people who knew me only as Margaret, not as someone's mother or someone's problem solver. Helen, my neighbor, was a widow for 10 years and had her own story of new beginnings. We had coffee together every morning, laughing at life's little silly things. Robert, from the book club, was a gentle gentleman who lost his wife to cancer and found his refuge in literature. We debated books with passion, sometimes disagreeing completely, and that was refreshing, having my own opinions about things that didn't matter to anyone but us. Dorothy, from the watercolor class, had 3 children who rarely visited her, and we found comfort in each other's stories, without judgment, only understanding. This new support network didn't replace my family, but showed that I could have an identity beyond it. The peace I found didn't come from the absence of relationships, but from their quality. It wasn't loneliness I was living, it was conscious choice. Choice to wake up and decide how to spend my day. Choice to say yes or no without guilt. Choice to prioritize my well-being without feeling selfish. The gold-digging daughters-in-law, Jennifer and Amanda, had completely disappeared from our lives, revealing themselves exactly as they always were. Opportunists who were in the family for comfort, not for love. And honestly, it was a relief when they left. Better to have the naked truth than to live in a comfortable illusion. My children realized this too, each in their own way. Michael admitted that the divorce, although painful, was liberating. Thomas said he felt foolish for not having seen the signs before. And me? I just thanked for finally having opened my eyes and found courage to choose myself, even if belatedly. A full year had passed since I moved to the cottage, and on that morning of my 73rd birthday, I woke up with a feeling I hadn't experienced in decades, pure contentment. It wasn't euphoric happiness. It wasn't the total absence of problems or worries. It was something deeper, more stable. It was the feeling of being exactly where I should be, living the life I chose for myself. I sat on the porch with my coffee, watching the seagulls flying over the sea, and allowed myself to reflect on the journey that brought me here. From discarded elderly mother to free woman at peace, from compulsive solver of others' problems to person who finally learned to live for herself. The emotional story had been painful, had been humiliating at times, but it had also been necessary, because sometimes life needs to break us so we can rebuild ourselves the right way. My children had planned a small celebration for my birthday, something simple and intimate that respected my new boundaries. They arrived at noon, Michael with the grandchildren, Sarah with a gift she'd made herself, a patchwork quilt sewn with pieces of old family clothes, and Thomas with a photo album he organized for months, showing our journey as a family over the years. There were no daughters-in-law present, obviously. Jennifer had remarried and rarely saw the children. Amanda simply disappeared, and Thomas discovered recently she was in another state with another man, repeating the same pattern as always. The gold-digging daughters-in-law had followed their paths, and none of us missed them. What mattered was there, on my small porch, eating simple cake and laughing at old stories. "Mom, we wanted to give you something special for your birthday," Michael began, and for a second my heart tightened, fearing it would be money or some material gesture that tried to compensate for the past. But it wasn't. We wrote letters, each of us, about what we learned this year, about how you changed our lives by stopping making everything easy. They handed me 3 envelopes, and I opened them right there, reading while tears silently rolled down my face. Michael wrote about learning humility, about discovering that being a man wasn't about having everything under control, but about having courage to rebuild when everything collapses. Sarah wrote about finding her own strength, about learning that dependency disguised as love isn't real love. Thomas wrote about pride, about how it almost destroyed him, and about gratitude for having a mother who loved him enough to let him fall and learn to get up alone. "You don't know how much these words mean to me," I said when I finished reading, hugging each of them. "But you also need to understand that I didn't do what I did to teach a lesson. I did it because I needed to survive, needed to protect myself, needed to choose myself after a lifetime choosing you." It was an honest conversation, raw, without the filters we used to use. We talked about hurts, about regrets, about the painful process of forgiveness, both from them to me and mine to them. It wasn't a fairy tale reconciliation where everything magically resolves. It was real. It was imperfect. It was human. And precisely because of that, it was genuine. Ungrateful child or not, they were still my children, and I still loved them. But now it was a love with boundaries, with respect, with dignity on both sides. The grandchildren played on the beach while we talked, their childish laughter serving as soundtrack to our difficult adult conversation. At some point, Michael's youngest daughter, Emma, ran up to me with a perfect shell she'd found. "Grandma, this is for you. It's the prettiest of all," she said with that pure enthusiasm only children have. I held the shell, so simple but so significant, and realized something important. By choosing myself, by establishing boundaries, by refusing to continue being the family's crutch, I hadn't lost my relationships. I'd transformed them. My grandchildren now visited me not out of obligation or convenience, but because they genuinely wanted to be with me. My children called me not because they needed something, but because they missed me, and that was worth more than all the gold in the world. Sarah pulled me aside later that afternoon, while the men cleaned the kitchen, something they never would have done in the past. "Mom, I know I've apologized 1,000 times, but I need to say it again. We were cruel, we were ungrateful, and you had every right to abandon us completely, to cut ties and never look back," she said, her eyes welling up. "But I understand now why you didn't do that, because real love isn't about making everything easy. It's about wanting people to grow, even when it hurts." I hugged my daughter, this woman who'd been an ungrateful daughter, but who was transforming into someone aware, responsible, strong. "You understood, daughter, and that's all I ever wanted, for you to understand." The total humiliation I felt that day at the nursing home seemed now a lifetime ago, replaced by this moment of genuine connection. When everyone left at the end of the day, I sat again on the porch, now watching the sunset paint the sky oranges and pinks, Helen showed up with a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. "Happy birthday, Margaret. Can I steal a bit of your time?" she asked with that warm smile she had. We poured the wine and stayed there, 2 old women who'd lived lives full of ups and downs, simply enjoying the present moment. "You know you're an inspiration, don't you?" Helen said suddenly. "The way you rebuilt your life, that you established boundaries with your family, even when it was difficult. I'm still trying to do that with mine." I smiled, realizing my story had impact beyond my own family. It was a real story that resonated with other women of my generation who'd also lost themselves in the role of eternal caregivers. The following months brought more changes, all positive. Michael got a better job and was slowly rebuilding his financial stability. Sarah had started a small craft business that was surprisingly successful, using the skills she developed in the occupational therapy she did. Thomas had found a new partner, Rebecca, a divorced woman with her own children who understood his scars and didn't expect him to be perfect. She visited me once, bringing flowers and a homemade pie, and I knew immediately she was different from the previous ones. There was no greed in her eyes, no calculated interest, just a genuine woman who liked my son for his merits, flaws, and all. "Mrs. Margaret, Thomas told me everything that happened. I want you to know I completely respect the boundaries you've established," she said. And that meant more than she could imagine. I continued expanding my own life, discovering passions I never had time to explore before. I started doing volunteer work at a local library, helping children with reading difficulties. I joined a walking group that explored coastal trails every weekend. I even started writing, nothing professional, just memories, reflections, stories from my life I wanted to preserve. I discovered I had a voice, perspectives, experiences worth sharing. For decades, I'd been defined by my roles: wife, mother, problem solver. Now, at 73, I was finally discovering who Margaret was as an individual. And she was fascinating, complex, resilient in ways I'd never realized while I was too busy taking care of everyone else. The children respected my new life impressively. They called before visiting, never showed up by surprise expecting me to interrupt my plans. When they needed advice, they asked if I had time to talk, didn't simply assume my availability. And most importantly, they'd learned to solve most of their own problems before turning to me. Michael called me once to proudly tell me he'd negotiated a debt alone without anyone's help. Sarah showed me her business finances, organized and balanced, fruit of her own effort. Thomas had bought a used but reliable car, paying cash with money he saved working overtime. They were growing finally in their 40s, but still growing. And I no longer felt the compulsive need to protect them from every difficulty. I was genuinely proud to see them fighting and winning their own battles. On a quiet afternoon, almost 2 years after everything happened, I received an unexpected call. It was a producer from a podcast about life stories, wanting to interview me. Apparently, Sarah had shared our story in a support group for adults in therapy, and someone knew someone who, well, you know how these things work. "Mrs. Margaret, your story about establishing boundaries even in your 70s, about choosing yourself after a lifetime of sacrifice, is exactly the type of narrative we want to share," the producer explained. I thought for a few days, talking to my children about it. "Mom, if you feel comfortable, I think it could help a lot of people," Michael said, and the others agreed. So I accepted, not to expose them or seek revenge, but because I realized my emotional story could really make a difference for other elderly mothers trapped in similar dynamics, other women who needed to hear that it's never too late to choose yourself, that forgiveness doesn't mean going back to accepting disrespect, that peace isn't loneliness, and that establishing boundaries isn't selfishness, it's survival, it's dignity, it's self-love. And after a lifetime giving love to others, I'd finally learned to give that love to myself too. And that's how I learned, at 73, that it's never too late to start over, to choose dignity, to establish boundaries. The pain of being discarded by my own children broke me, it's true. But it was precisely in that breaking that I discovered my true strength. Today, I live in peace, not because I erased the past or pretended nothing happened, but because I chose to forgive without going back to accepting disrespect. My children learned, the hardest way, that love isn't dependency, that a mother isn't a crutch, and that respect isn't optional. And me? I finally learned that taking care of myself isn't selfishness, it's necessity, that peace isn't loneliness, it's conscious choice, and that even after a lifetime giving myself to others, there was still time to discover myself, to live with my own purpose, to be simply Margaret, not just someone's mother, but someone in her own right. And you, have you gone through something similar? Have you ever felt discarded by people you should be able to trust? Have you ever had to choose between your own dignity and others' comfort? What would you do if you were in my place? Would you forgive and rebuild the ties, or move forward without looking back? Tell me your story in the comments. I want to know your opinion about all this. If this story touched your heart, if you identified with some piece of it, or if you know someone who needs to hear this, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss other emotional stories that bring life lessons and make us reflect on our own choices and relationships. Because in the end, we all deserve to live with dignity, respect, and peace, no matter how old we are. A big hug, and until the next story.